for our final panel presentation. And this one is rather unique. This will seek to turn the issues that were aired in the prior session into solutions by talking about ways that new media, new forms of communication can play roles in reestablishing that sense of broken trust across the medical landscape. This is a panel of professional communicators who are disseminating information through social media, through podcasts, and through self-publishing platforms. Here to lead this conversation is Kate Pickert, a professor of journalism at the Bellarmine College of Liberal Arts at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles. She was a staff writer at Time Magazine and is the author of Radical, The Science, Culture, and History of Breast Cancer in America. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me to be here today with all of you. I'm going to introduce our two panelists are here, as well as Dr. Kate Arney, who's joining us from the UK. Can you guys hear me okay? Okay. I just wanted to mention before I introduce these ladies that I'm also a former breast cancer patient myself. I was diagnosed with HER2 positive breast cancer in 2014. And really benefited, obviously, from Herceptin and all of the great scientific advances that have been made, in large part because of, I know there's investigators and scientists here, so I'm very grateful for my own experience. And I just wanted to mention I have a perspective as a healthcare journalist, but also as a former patient. So to my left is Dr. Elaine Schattner. Elaine is a physician and cancer survivor as well, whose book From Whispers to Shouts, The Way We Talk About Cancer, probes shifting attitudes toward cancer throughout history. A former practicing blood and cancer specialist, she's a clinical associate professor of medicine at Weill Cornell Medicine in New York. So thanks for flying in. And to her left is Dr. Shannon La Cava, who's a clinical psychologist and director of the Sims-Man UCLA Center for Integrative Oncology, a really groundbreaking place. I was a patient at UCLA, so I'm familiar. She specializes in integrative and psychosocial oncology and leads a team of more than 30 clinicians, nutritionists, psychiatrists, chaplains, mind-body practitioners dedicated to delivering whole-person care to patients at UCLA Health. And then on the screen over here, or where is Kat? Oh, here she is. Hi. And Dr. Kat Arney is an award-winning science writer and broadcaster. Her most recent book, Rebel Cell, is fantastic, and I saw it's for sale in the gift shop here. And that book talks about cancer through an evolutionary lens. She was the principal media spokesperson for Cancer Research UK, a really important large charity organization in the UK. And she's also a podcaster. She's done tons of radio work. And now she is the founder and chief creative officer of a firm called First Create the Media, which does communication strategy for folks in the sciences. So this is her bread and butter. A lot of what was talked about in the previous panel, which I think will just kind of take off from that previous panel because these topics are really related. Okay, so that's our illustrious panel. So, you know, I'm sure you all are aware of a lot of media reports today about the most recent report from the American Cancer Society about cancer rates over time, and in particular, the kind of alarming rise in cancer diagnoses of young folks under 50 and women in particular. And I know Sanjay talked about, you know, sort of audiences for TikTok aren't necessarily Gen Z folks purely, right? Everyone is kind of involved in that, but those younger people are going to go to the web for information and insight. So I think the conversation is really timely. And we're going to talk a little bit about kind of the upsides and the downsides of new ways of communicating about cancer, but I think maybe we could start with some of the positives a little bit. So Elaine, I wondered if you could kick us off and just kind of, how is the experience of being a cancer patient now different in this kind of new age of social media, blogs, self-publishing, podcasting? How has the patient experience been transformed because of that?
Sure. Well, hi, everyone, and thanks, Kate, and to the organizers for this invitation. When I was a cancer patient in starting in late 2002, there was no Facebook. I was practicing oncology. I tried to maintain some privacy from my patients. I had 2 young children. My sons were 8 and 10. And we didn't talk about it much. With the guidance from a teacher at my son's school, I elected to explain to them that I had cancer, which was a controversial decision back then. This was just an administrator at the school. She said, they'll figure it out. Better to be honest with them, and then they'll trust you more. They'll believe what you say. But that kind of advice was not available freely in my community, and I live in Manhattan where people are pretty open and modern. Now, there's almost a pressure to disclose a diagnosis of cancer. And people also are very free with advice. So the experience of being a patient, I think, is in some ways much more overwhelming, in part because there's so many different and novel sources of information. There are more opinions. And I might add that I think there's more at stake because there are better treatments now than there were 20 years ago. So it used to be, with exception, that if you had an advanced cancer diagnosis, your prognosis was poor, and you could take treatments as you chose, but it might not have mattered so much as I and my colleagues would have liked to think. Now it matters a lot. As we've heard, some patients get really good drugs, and some patients not so often do they get those drugs. And so the sources of information that patients seek out, I think, matter more on medical outcomes. And even the social media things, even movies, films, fiction can influence patients' decisions. So I think, how has the experience changed? The prognosis medically is better, and the decisions are harder for patients. There's more of a burden on patients and their families in the decisions that they make.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, that the stakes are higher. I remember when I was diagnosed, my oncologist telling me to stay off the internet, and this was 10 years ago, so it's before TikTok and all that. But she was saying that to me because a lot of the information was outdated, particularly for my subtype of breast cancer, and that's true in breast cancer and in many cancers, that there's just so much innovation, things change every year, as one of the previous panelists talked about. Shannon, I wondered, since you are a psychologist specializing in cancer patients, could you talk a little bit about sort of how does access to all of this information and different ways of communicating online kind of affect the mental well-being of cancer patients today?
Yes, thank you, Kate, and hello, everyone. It definitely can make an impact. It can be a good impact, and it can also have negative impact. When there's so much information, I think you can get lost in that. If you don't know what you're looking for, or if you see various pieces of information that conflict from one another, it's kind of, where do you start? What do you believe? And I think that can have the negative impact on a person. So there's ways to, I think, connect with your provider, connect with your team, see kind of where to start. Oftentimes even connecting with others that may have been through a similar cancer or even another cancer just in general. And I think this is where you can start the sense of your own team and community, and kind of have those people around you that you can trust as you dive into that information. But at the same time, and I think it came up in one of the earlier talks about when would you rather have a whole lot of information or not too much information? Because if you have everything out there, at least there is those novel treatments, those ideas, those things that are coming out, the evidence-based options, they're there. So it's kind of like, how do you comb through all of that? But definitely, I think if we're looking at the idea of distress, and we haven't talked about that too much today, and that is a natural reaction to a cancer diagnosis that's already there. So how do we alleviate distress, also give information, education, and try to do so in a way that is going to be the most supportive to that patient and also into the medical decisions that they make with their provider and family?
Yeah, and obviously there's such a connection between the emotional response and kind of how a patient might approach therapy and approach treatments. Kat, in addition to all of her work as a public broadcaster and media strategist, Kat also has a PhD and is a scientist herself. Kat, I just wanted to ask you, how do you think the role of science and health journalism is changing right now, and has changed particularly in recent years? What opportunities does it offer, and what are sort of some of the challenges?
Yeah, so I hope everyone can hear me okay. Yeah, awesome. So yeah, I was at Cancer Research UK from a period from 2004 to 2016, and that was just a huge time of change. I was involved in science communication teams as a media spokesperson, training our scientists in how to communicate with the public. And during that time, there was sort of huge changes in the media landscape. So we saw the rise of social media, Facebook, particularly at first, and Twitter, and also changes, things like YouTube starting to happen, and science blogging. And I think this changed during this time, and we were really ahead of the curve. I think Cancer Research UK set up one of the first science blogs because we realized this was a really powerful way for us to write and tell our own stories to the public, to the charity supporters, to cancer patients. So I think that the new forms of communication we have, things like podcasts, things like organizations and people, bloggers, being able to be their own media source, I think in some ways has been incredibly powerful. There is so much really good science writing, really clear explanations of the science behind cancer, of the advances. I think that's been fantastic. The way that podcasts enable people to have conversations, to hear that in that really intimate way. I'm a big fan of radio and podcasts for that intimacy. So I think those things have been really fantastic. As we've seen, I think we can all admit that the kind of the mainstream media is fracturing. It's a very challenging environment for many reasons, in terms of trust, in terms of funding. So the ability of organizations and individuals to be their own media, I think, has been a benefit. But I think, as we'll probably come on to, there are also problems, because fact checking is not now really a thing.
Yeah, as a longtime establishment mainstream journalist, I'm yeah, stressed
Sorry.
out. um, yeah, I mean, you just mentioned, Kat, I think something that's really important about podcasting, and I guess radio as well, sort of the intimacy of that experience. It's different than reading, right? Listening to stories and folks have conversations. But I think you're also touching on something that I mean, I'm a journalism professor as well as a health journalist, this kind of flattening of information and media, right? Where sort of everything kind of looks the same. Like we've been talking for years, like on Facebook, the difference between a New York Times story being posted on Facebook and a random person posting a blog post, it kind of all looks the same. So discerning sort of sources of information and what's reliable has definitely become more challenging. I just wanted to mention one other, and I don't want to talk more than our panelists, so I'll stop chattering. But one way I just wanted to point out you all being here, in addition to you all being here, this conference is being live streamed, which a lot of cancer conferences are now. So I think one way in terms of digital communication and how the web has given people more access is, patients can actually attend cancer conferences generally for free online. And COVID really made a big difference with that, and that's something that has kind of stuck around. But of course, if we're honest, there are some downsides too to all these new ways of communicating online. And Sanjay brought up a bunch of this in the previous panel, but I wanted to hear from you guys too. Sort of there are trade-offs to all of this kind of flood of information. And it feels like this is a new phenomenon, this idea of like misinformation and sort of quackery kind of around cancer. But Kat and Elaine in particular, I know you have studied kind of the history of cancer messaging. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit, like contextualize this for us. Sort of what are we experiencing now in terms of misinformation around this topic, and how does that compare, kind of throughout history? And Elaine, can you? Oh, Kat, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I can see Kat here. That's why I'm looking
That's
there.
I'll wave my hand. Yeah, I've had a long-term interest in cancer and conspiracism around cancer. It's sort of weird interest of mine. But I've been looking back. So at Cancer Research UK, I got very interested in the history of the charity and going back through all the old records and looking back at old papers. And there's some fascinating papers right from sort of 1902, 1904, published in the British Journal of Medicine from Ernest Bashford, who was the first chief medical officer of Cancer Research UK. And he's writing in there about cancer and quackery. And it's very funny that one of the things he complains about is that this cancer cure that is not real is being touted in the pages of the Daily Mail. And that 120 years later, we can still hear scientists complaining about this kind of thing. And I think what has not changed is why cancer does enable misinformation and conspiracism around it, because it is a really hard biological problem. We've been doing hardcore cancer research for over a century and people still die. We have not, this is not a solved problem. What has changed is the access to information and to misinformation, the ability to really build very interconnected communities online around that. So rather than one person talking to one other person, their neighbor, about, oh, did you, why don't they know this? Why can't they do better? You can have 1,000 people or more on an internet forum or listening to a podcast where they're saying, oh, why can't they do better? They must know something. So I think the fundamentals of why people want to believe misinformation have not changed, but just the access to misinformation and the ability to build community around that as well, I think is accelerating.
I think you referred to some important history. I might add that what I think is the greatest change is the increase in sources of misinformation. So say 100 years ago, there were doctors called that conventional doctors called quacks, who offered bogus cures, painless salves, stuff like that. And the reason they did so, for the most part, was because they could make money selling those things. And the AMA here in the United States pursued some of those fraudsters with varying degrees of success. The way that false cancer hospitals and those quack doctors made money was by advertising and appealing to people who were desperate. Now, people couldn't just publish stories or post them to the internet. Now anyone can put out their experiences and also sell their stuff on the web. And so you hear more and more crazy stories, and there are more offerings of bogus treatments. At the same time, the web offers more true information. Patients can read medical literature, they can go to conferences, as Kate said, they can watch videos such as this, and potentially they can be more informed and more wary of misinformation and ask better questions of their physicians about stuff they may hear of. So I think the diversity of misinformation in source has expanded, and the potential to combat that also is greater than it ever was through the web and patients' access potentially to reliable information if they're educated and can read it or hear it.
Shannon, I wondered if you could sort of, do you have any actual, experiences of talking to patients and talking to them about how they're kind of navigating this, sort of flood between their doctor and, because I know that you folks at Sims Mann at UCLA do, it's a complimentary sort of service for patients there. So I know that you're close to that. Can you talk a little bit about
Absolutely.
Personal experiences? Yeah.
Thank you. And I also want to pull something in that Kat said and kind of tie those two things together. In hearing with patients at UCLA and in my prior work in nonprofit, when someone has a diagnosis with cancer, and I don't need to tell this group, one of the things that happens just to so many people is this feeling of isolation and being alone. And so I think if we can have that as an undertone of this conversation, and if we're looking at these as various platforms of connection, I think that is a benefit. So back to our early part of this is like, how can we see this as a silver lining? And so Kat spoke a little bit about that community, right? There's an online community, but whatever community somebody can find, I think there's benefit in that. So in working with the patients that we have, it is, if they're working with a provider and then they can get connected with social work and they can have individual counseling, they can join a support group, or they can have access to education. We're online now. I think many institutions and organizations that once upon a time had lunch and learns or some kind of gathering has changed, but it increases access as well. It also is available if somebody in the middle of the night wants information. It's nice that we can provide that information at larger institutions or in collaboration with community-based organizations to get factual content available at no cost to patients and have it be targeted to the information that they're seeking. But I think all of those things are ways to really connect a patient to another patient, to another person, to someone who gets it. I think we brought the idea of people that get it. And I think that can help reduce some of that isolation. It can be very normalizing when symptoms or situations can seem so confusing, and the thought that no one else might be experiencing this, and then find out that someone does, and it makes it a little easier to get through that experience and situation. So I think that it ties through that face-to-face as well as these online platforms that we're talking about here.
Yeah, I think, patients will often trust other patients, perhaps even more than their doctor, about what the experience will be like, because another patient has actually been through it. And doctors, as much as they interface with patients and read the literature, and it's not the same as here's what it was like for me. Elaine, you just brought something up that I'd also love you and Kat to expand on a little bit, this idea that there was money to be made in kind of pushing quackery around cancer. And I think that it's perhaps not so dissimilar from today, right? So online is, on social media in particular, and I wish Sanjay was still here because I'm sure he could talk a lot about this. Oh, he is here. Oh, hi. You're over there now. You were over here before. Hi. I listened to your podcast. It's great. You should listen to his podcast. And we'll get into this idea of oncologists making podcasts who actually know what they're talking about and can talk about medicine and science in an accessible way, which you do beautifully. But outrage, engagement, controversy are the things that cause people to consume content on social media. And so social media is sort of primed for this stuff. So, all these folks who are cancer influencers online, sometimes that can be great, but a lot of times it can provide a perverse incentive to kind of push that stuff. And Kat, I was going to ask you, because we had a conversation before today a little bit about this, and you brought up Joe Rogan, and we were talking a little bit about this idea of sort of why is it hard for real scientists, real folks with expertise to kind of break through and kind of reach audiences when there's so many other folks, other personalities online. And I know this is partly what you do, is work with scientists to help them communicate. So could you talk a little bit about that?
It's because this stuff is hard. I do get people saying to me, and it's like, why are people listening to Joe Rogan? It's just, I don't know if I'm allowed to swear, but like it's bullshit. And why are we, why is he getting away with it? And in the UK, there's a guy called Stephen Bartlett. He does a podcast called Diary of a CEO. And there's been some controversy lately with him doing a lot more pseudoscience wellness content that is not based in science. And the reason is that stuff does really well because people want to find these sort of secrets that they're not telling you. But also the reason that people like Joe Rogan do really well is because they're really good. And that's the problem. I've listened to a lot of science-based podcasts that are just boring, complicated, not recorded well, not, they're just not good. And obviously, you've got someone here like Sanjay who's bucking that trend fantastically. But if we are to tell compelling stories, I think we have to use the tropes and the tactics of things that are successful and popular. We can't just point the finger and go, oh, why is he popular and he's bad and wrong? Like, he's interesting and people love to listen to him, whether they agree with him or not. So I think really upping the quality and not being afraid to use the tropes and the tactics of the modern digital media. I think we could learn a lot from the people who are successful and steal their tactics.
Can you hear me? Oh, there we go. Elaine, I know you wanted to talk a little bit about influencers online as well. Share your thoughts.
Sure. Well, I think, and as we've discussed, patients are desperate for information, and many do trust the peer patients as sources of information, and that happens both in real communities and online. I think that most people, or many educated people at least, know that doctors may have conflicts of interest, that they may be supported by pharmaceutical companies, that they may receive, they or their institution may receive support based on how many patients they enroll in clinical trials. They also have academic ideas, their careers basically, that may depend on recruitment of patients to trials and particular theories. And that's all fine. That's part of what drives research, doctors' egos and scientists' egos and wanting to find cures. That's fine. And the support is needed and helpful. I think, though, that people have to be transparent about the sources of their support. So that would include doctors and scientists, as most people know. So doctors now are supposed to disclose their financial support when they speak at meetings, and that is happening more and more, and I would say in the US usually does happen. But patients also get support from pharmaceutical companies. So when I was more active as a journalist, I would attend cancer conferences where often the patients were funded for their travel to the conference by pharmaceutical companies. And the pharmaceutical companies, at several meetings I attended, actually had video stations where patients could tell their stories. And then those stories would be posted to the web. And it fascinated me because the patients who told their stories, like every one of us, wanted to make a difference in the world. So there they were, whether they may have had an aggressive end-stage cancer and said, I hope that research will find cures for my kids, or they may have been a person who survived and is living long after an early stage cancer, just sort of exemplifying the benefits of good modern oncology care. But often there was basically what the patients do when especially if they have advanced disease and they're doing well, is they're showcasing the success of those pharmaceutical companies' drugs. And that's useful to pharma. It's useful to the patients, and it's useful to the patients who may be watching those videos or accessing a website that they don't know is sponsored by pharma, because they see, cancer treatments may work, my condition is not hopeless. And those messages counter fatalism, which I think is really a huge misinformation, if you want, or a misidea. But I think that the idea of transparency on the provider of information side, the influencer on social media, be it TikTok or YouTube or wherever they are, or podcaster. I think unfortunately, a lot of the influencers don't disclose their sources of support. And so what we as the public can do, and what patients and their families can do, is to always be questioning. So just consider, who's supporting this person? Are they doing it as a volunteer because they really care? Are they doing it just because they need for some psychological reason to share their story, which is fine? Or are they doing it because they're getting paid to tell this story that supports a particular agenda? And so I think we need to be critical of the sources when we find material online and also in communities.
Can I pop in here?
I think that. Oh yeah, Kat, please. Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is a really, really interesting tension, because I think, particularly in the world of cancer patients and cancer information, there's this sort of undercurrent that basically pharma is kind of evil and isn't really committed to actually curing cancer, or they just want to sell drugs. And this is a problem, because unless anyone has any better ideas, the pharmaceutical industry is how we turn science into treatments. Like, we cannot we cannot have new medicines without the kind of level of investment and research that pharmaceutical companies bring to the table. So this is the problem. And I think the biggest problem is that pharma has been its own worst enemy, and they've done some really terrible things. And even now, I write a lot about this in my book, about the kind of the slicing and dicing of results. One trial results that was like, a matter of days or weeks difference in survival from one drug versus another drug. Like, that's just rubbish, right? That is not progress, and patients can see that that is not progress. So I think that there needs to be a bit of a reset with how, well, I'd love to see a big reset with how the pharma industry actually works, and trying to bring forward treatments that do actually move the needle effectively. And then I think that could do a lot more to restore trust. Like, they are a massive player. They're an inevitable part of the cancer care system that we have. So we can't take them out of the equation. But I do think that there could definitely be things that are done a lot better, that will sort of take the stain and the stench of the pharma industry out of communications that are either funded by them or done by them.
Yeah, I mean, I think, when we talk about influencers and sort of why do people want to listen to those stories to maybe avoid fatalism and to find some hope, and also why do folks trust influencers on social media? It kind of reminds me of research I did for my book about celebrity stories, right? So there's so many stories in the news media about celebrities who have cancer, and I always find them so void of detail. Okay, well, what kind of breast cancer did you have? And all of those kind of details that really help determine outcome and what their experience was as a patient. Shannon, can you talk a little bit about sort of the power of story, which I think is a big part of digital communication today and podcasting and things like that, in determining how patients kind of see their own disease and their future survival?
Oh, that's a good question. Thank you. There's so much power in stories on different layers. I was actually talking today with somebody in development, and it's the story that connects somebody to the mission of doing this work. And for a patient being able to tell their own story, I think there's so much power in that. There's narrative therapy. There's just the component of having some control over your own story and seeing progress. And then I think to the point of just storytelling and how it can be supportive of others, I think we can learn from one another, and we can learn from those stories. You mentioned how in a celebrity story there might be gaps in the elements that you really wanted to learn about, right? So I think in terms of that connection piece, if we're communicating with one another and we're telling our story, I think that's where we're showing our vulnerabilities, and we're able to show somebody how we made it through, if it was a cancer patient telling a story to someone else that's going through it, but also just the ability to kind of, I see, look from where someone started to where they are going, where they are currently, and where they are hopeful to be. The idea of the story is, I think, a connecting way for their path to kind of blend with the paths of others, and that's, I think, a lot of that level of community that they're going to be building with online platforms or person to person.
Yeah, it can be really cathartic, I think. I mean, having written about my own cancer, I can attest to that. Yeah, for sure. Elaine?
I'd like to offer a sort of counterpoint to the story narrative, if that's okay. I was thinking after we had a Zoom, I guess last week, seems like ages ago, about this panel, and Kat was talking about the importance of stories, because those are what most people want. That's what people hear. That's the stories resonate. And my mother-in-law, when her sister had cancer, she didn't care about data. She didn't want to know anything technical. She wanted to know that there was someone who had lived for a long time with the kind of cancer her sister had. For me, it was all useless. And among the things I've done in my career is I went to journalism school and worked as a journalist. And what editors wanted were stories. And what I said once to the dean of Columbia's journalism school was, I don't get it. Like, why do we need these stories? For me, I liked evidence. I liked just data. I wanted to know that the difference between two drugs was, 14%, and the confidence intervals were whatever they were. And the stories didn't make a difference in my thinking. But that was just me, and I think that the point I'm trying to make is there are people to whom data appeal. And I think that the value of the stories depend, as you're saying, on who's telling the story and the validity of the story, but also, and how representative their story is, but also the person who's hearing the story. Because for some people, stories just don't influence their behavior or their reasoning. So I think that the audience for what we're saying and the information we're sharing online, however we're sharing it, shouldn't just be stories. There needs to be good data, and I often wish when I read news, both social media and conventional news stories, that they presented the facts, whether buried in the article or otherwise, but that those be made clear.
Yeah, and Kat, I want to come back to you, but I just wanted to mention one thing, which is, you know, in the old days, if a celebrity had a story to tell about their cancer, they would go to a journalist, and the journalist would hear their story and then kind of vet the facts and kind of try to contextualize it. I mean, hopefully, if it was a good journalist. But today, public personalities, celebrities can directly tell their story right to the public. And, you know, you can call it sort of a gatekeeper, but you could also call it kind of a vetting, kind of in between that. Now, many celebrities deserve a lot of credit for helping bring cancer out of the shadows and, you know, talking about it publicly. And, you know, we've all written about that, and that's really important. But, you know, the changing role of the traditional news media is what has kind of paved the way for where we are now. Kat, I'm sure you want to jump in a little bit on this. And also, if you have thoughts on what we're just speaking about, please share. But I also wanted to ask you, when scientists and healthcare folks come to you and say, I want to hire you to help me figure out how to communicate, what are you seeing in those clients, and how do you help them without giving away your proprietary business strategic advice?
There's no magic to it. The first thing is this actually good science? So that's always what I've always been led by. One of the key values that we have as a communication agency is integrity. You know, we're no nonsense. We're not buying it. We're not selling it. So anyone that comes to me and says, I've got this innovation, I've got this startup, I've got this thing, I'm like, okay, I want to see the stuff, I want to see the papers, I want to see the data. So I don't know how to tell a story about what's not there, and I won't do it. So there has to be some there. I think what is interesting, and I work a lot with really innovative startups, and obviously quite a lot of those are in oncology, because oncology is a massive area for biotech and for pharma, is is this actually something that I'm most attracted to? The organizations where, if this comes off, this is going to change the world. So is this not just another kinase inhibitor? Is this actually a really interesting technology or a platform or a way of doing something that is new and is different and is going to make a tangible difference? So I think those are the kinds of things that I'm attracted to. And then in terms of telling the story, it's interesting hearing Elaine saying, she wants the data. Do the data speak for themselves? I've always felt that we must speak for them. We do have to provide context and explanation. What is the world like now? What does our innovation do to change the world? And then what could the world be like if this innovation actually happens, or through our actions? So those are the sorts of things I'm thinking about. And the science is absolutely at the heart of it. You've got to understand, you really have to understand the science to explain it in a story in a way that's clear and true to the science. So those are the sorts of things that I'm thinking about when trying to communicate around innovations and companies. When I'm doing something broader, like writing my books, I am looking for the stories in the papers. Oh my goodness, there's a mother who accidentally gave cancer to her daughter as part of a medical experiment. Those are wild. There are cannibal hamsters that pass cancer cells through mosquito bites. These stories are amazing, and you have to pull them out of the science. But that's sort of maybe a different thing.
Kate, may I add? I think looking at it also from another lens is, if someone's looking for a story, maybe someone's looking to see somebody that has been through successfully the treatment, the diagnosis, the care, and make it to the other side of their cancer journey and have no evidence of disease and be healthy. And sometimes it's not something to read or to hear, in a blog. They're actually just looking for that model or that hope and trust that it's possible for them. So maybe it's not just the telling of a story, which I think is very powerful, but it is, how do I connect with somebody who I see myself in and can see myself into the future? And there's community-based organizations that can provide that level of connection to our earlier points of like what different platforms are out there. There are peer-to-peer networks. There are organizations like Immerman Angels that connect somebody who's recently diagnosed to somebody who has signed up as a peer mentor who's been through a similar diagnosis. So there are ways to hear a story, but also to be able to witness that they're not alone and someone else has gone through this, and they can hear, like, maybe how did you do that? Or I have questions. And that, I think, I wouldn't want to put aside everything that you just mentioned about the evidence and the treatment and the protocols and all of that stuff, the science of it. It's so valuable. But also sometimes I think there's just that, like, how can I make it through? What do I need to know? And that can be something that can alleviate some of that, or that distress that we spoke of earlier.
So this will be less of a counterpoint. Shannon, I think that the title of our session is something about new ways of communicating about cancer. And so it occurs to me that one way that's new in a way is patients talking to patients. Because few people used to survive for very long after a cancer diagnosis. So when Shannon is talking about communities and connections and peer patients reaching out one to another, and Kat is talking about patients sharing their experiences and the stories of patients being shared. That's really peer-to-peer communication, which through advances in science is enhanced. So it used to be, say, in the 60s, women who had breast cancer started communicating peer-to-peer, and there was a Reach to Recovery was begun actually in the 1950s, where women who had had mastectomy would visit and reach out to other mastectomy patients. And then that organization grew, and then there were support groups and so forth. But very few people lived long after a cancer diagnosis, with the exception of breast cancer, at least who lived long, who were open about it. Now you have people who are living long with lung cancer, melanoma, maybe even pancreatic cancer. That's getting better. Everything is getting better, with exception. And so people in their lives, their teachers, their colleagues at work, their parents, they're seeing people live longer. They're saying, oh, I heard you had this. What was your experience? Do you have any advice for me? Or people are just offering that. And so that peer-to-peer communication, in an odd way, is actually a surprising modern thing, thanks to science, and I might argue thanks to the war on cancer, in part. But yeah, so
I think even that basic message that things are getting better, I think if all you consume is sort of social media, cancer on social media, you may think that's not true. But, of course that is the case. I think that's a podcast idea. Every week, a guest coming on who has done really well throughout their treatment. And Sanjay, I'm thinking, and I took a note when you said this in the previous panel, this idea of evergreen content online, which I think is so important. Who's going to, subscribe to a podcast about cancer if they don't have cancer in their lives? Like, are people, with all of the things you can listen to on Spotify and iTunes and all the different podcasts, why are you going to spend an hour every week on a cancer conversation if you're not having a personal experience, or you're not a clinician, or someone who's in kind of the cancer world? However, the cool thing about podcasts that, kind of isn't the case necessarily with traditional radio, Kat, is that podcasts live forever online, right? So having podcast episodes, like for providers who are here, bookmarking some really good podcast episodes about various topics, and then being able to direct your patients there, I think could be a really positive thing. And also, I guess I'm sitting here wondering, and Kat, I'll throw this to you, but, should we have media training as a part of medical school?
Oh my God.
These days in this no, but in the modern, communication environment, having folks in the sciences who can really communicate is really, really critical, especially with so much misinformation and, dare I say, even disinformation. Kat, I wondered if you could, talk a little bit about that. Why don't doctors communicate better?
Well, yeah, I'll come to that. But I do kind of want to pick up on your assumption that people won't listen to a podcast about cancer if they don't have cancer in their lives. Like, people will listen to things that are good and interesting. So I think, again, this is the challenge. It's like, let's just make better things. The people who listen to Joe Rogan aren't necessarily interested in every episode that he's making. I listened to a World War II podcast. I just kind of got into it. I'm not a military historian. I just really find the people charismatic and the stories that they tell are interesting. So I think the assumption that the topic of cancer is not interesting. Cancer covers so many things. There's the sociology of it, the history of it, the language of it, and all the science of it, and every different aspect of it. So I think, if people are only listening to podcasts about cancer because they have cancer in their lives, like, that's a challenge to make better podcasts, I would say. And that does then speak to the what we can do about enabling this. In the pre-call for this, we talked about, well, what would make a difference? What would make a difference in the communication? And one is money. But as discussed, like, the source of that money matters, and the transparency behind that matters, and what sources of money people trust or don't trust. I think there's a big role for nonprofits in funding really quality science communication. It's great to see a conference like this being live streamed. I think training is really important. This stuff does not come naturally. Public speaking is not a thing that we're all born knowing how to do. Speaking on the radio, interviewing people, feeling comfortable and charismatic on camera or on mic is something you can learn. And the people who also, it's not obligatory. My heart sinks when I'm asked to interview someone who's just been put up for it, and this is the person you have to do. And I'd much rather speak to someone who loves it and is a passionate communicator, but has been taught to think about the language they use, the metaphors they use, how to spin a story. These things can be taught. But if they're going to be taught, I think you need to have recognition and time given to people. So it is changing. I know about in the UK for a long time, academics who did science communication was like, well, you've got to do that in your spare time. This doesn't count for anything. And increasingly it is being recognized in the things like the research excellence frameworks. To do public science communication is actually something worth recognizing and celebrating. And the people who are good at it need to be encouraged instead of slightly looked askance, a bit media, aren't they? We need to celebrate and encourage the people who are really good at this, because we're up against the people who are really, really good at this. So let's find, who's the Joe Rogan of cancer podcasting. Let's find them. He may well be sitting in the audience right there. So let's find them and promote them and find more of them, is what my plea would be.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice. I wonder if any of you have thoughts on sort of what types of topics that clinicians and those in the kind of cancer provider community could engage with that might help draw in some of these audiences that are living on social media, for example. And I'm thinking about this mention on the previous panel about there's a difference between integrative oncology and alternative medicine, that those are not the same thing, right, as we all know. But sort of engaging with folks who might be inclined to be interested in that stuff. And, does that, is the audience who would be interested in this kind of digital content, social media, podcasting, is that a different audience than the folks who traditionally, have been our audiences for cancer messaging over time? I wonder if you have thoughts on that, or Kat. What types of content, because I think one of the themes of today in this conference is that doctors often don't have enough time in visits to sort of explain as much as they would like, and so in that void, their patients will go somewhere. So what kinds of additional content are folks looking for?
I might share a little, and then I think definitely handing it off to Kat and Elaine on more of like the podcast and technical components of it. But I see our patients and families are interested in anything that they can learn that can give them a little bit of control back. So whether it be diet, nutrition, or are there to the integrative oncology piece, are there meditations that they can do? Is there something that they can do on their own that can help them feel a little bit better, alleviate some of their anxiety or depression or whatever symptoms that they are experiencing at that time? So I would say if you have content that can be creative, to Kat's point, engaging, and that can give a little bit of control back to somebody, I would start there. And then I would hand it off to both of you of how you might be able to do something like that or engage presenters.
Yeah, I think diet and nutrition is something definitely cancer patients are really interested in. There's sort of misinformation around that too, but it's not completely off base. It's definitely something worth engaging with and talking with. And I think for a long time, it may be the case that a lot of doctors didn't engage as much on some of these emerging insights into cancer growth.
In my experience practicing oncology, I observed that patients have varied needs of information. So there were people who would come into the office and they would come in with already having done some research often, and they would ask many questions. They would seek multiple opinions, and they would want to know as much as possible. I remember one man, he used to graph his labs in the hospital. He had Excel open somehow at a time when it wasn't easy to do so. And, he tracked everything, which I guess afforded him some sense of control. But I think he also really wanted to know. He wanted to know his white count every day. He wanted to know the difference between two possible chemo drugs. He wanted to know the mechanism of action, etc. There are other people who would come in and they say, what do you think? What would you do if it were someone in your family, doctor? And they didn't want to know anything more than that. There are some people who, in fact, there still probably are, people who would say, don't tell me, tell my wife, tell my son, I don't want to know. And I think that, so people's wants for information vary. Some people have become fixated on diet. Others may want to know the nuanced differences about chemotherapy, which will draw less traffic. If a journalistic outlet or an influencer is measuring traffic and their income depends on traffic, the sexier topics, nutrition to a point, but even more so, sex and cancer, or just arguing about the color pink, or whether cancer's a battle, those are all kind of topics that people like to just talk about. And so those kinds of topics get a lot of traffic, but they may not be what a patient really needs to know, which is the more nuanced information that might be provided by an oncologist, or with or without AI, be it at a massive level. I think the problem, as several people today have said, is that oncologists have different opinions about best treatments, best trials, what's not ready for use yet, and so now that there's so much open information, which I think is essential, patients are more aware of the debates than they used to be. So, they may get two very detailed conflicting opinions on the internet or through, just going to see different kinds of doctors. There's no way around that. But I think the greater point is I think there's a demand for all kinds of information and all levels of information.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunities presented by all these new forms of communication, but one thing that's resonating with me today and hearing all of this is it's made the oncologist job perhaps more challenging because there's more demands on time. I was thinking about asking you all in the audience, how many folks in here are clinicians? Raise your hand. How many of you are active on social media about oncology? What it's like, and as a journalist who's constantly asked to blog and podcast and make a Facebook post about that and tweet about that, and our physicians are also being asked to kind of do a lot of that. But Elaine, you just brought up something I think really important, which is that there's such a range of patients. I've interviewed so many cancer patients, and some of them said, I didn't want to know anything. I just wanted to do what my doctor said and just be done with it. And then me, as a healthcare journalist, when I was diagnosed, I was like, I want everything. I want every journal article. I want to read absolutely everything. I want to clinical trial shop and find my, best possible opportunities, et cetera. So there is a range, and I think it's important that oncologists are kind of prepared to offer some added value to all different types of patients, those that want more information, those who may want more kind of psychosocial support. And Elaine, you just brought up this topic of sex and cancer, but I actually think that's a really important topic, especially in breast cancer, that with endocrine therapy, it's a really, really important subject that I think nobody really talked about much kind of 20 years ago, at least in the public sphere. And now because of the web, women and patients and spouses are sharing experiences like that, which is helping provide more connection. So I just wanted to give an opportunity for just a final thought from each of you on kind of, strategies to move forward to kind of harness the internet in positive ways, or, things that we really need to be careful of, or kind of what's coming up next. So I'm putting you all on the spot with like a final thought. And Kat, I'd love to start with you.
Oh, this is brilliant. Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. I think there are different audiences, and I've said, oh, let's find the Joe Rogan of cancer that's very broad, but niches are still big when you have a global digital audience. And I do think some of the AI tools like translations and all this kind of stuff are really powerful. There are also mind-bending tools. I don't know if anyone in the audience has played around with Google's notebook large language model, but you can put in a blog article and it will generate a podcast that sounds like two people having a conversation with all the information in that article, but it will also add stuff in as well. Like it's mind-bending. And I think some of these generative AI technologies have the potential to be very powerful, but also the potential to be incredibly, incredibly harmful. We're already seeing search. Google search is now basically throwing up AI stuff. Sometimes it's right, sometimes it's absolutely rubbish. If you use ChatGPT as a search engine, sometimes it will be right, sometimes it's absolutely rubbish. And I'm very concerned certainly from a science communication perspective, and from someone who loves the scientific literature, there's already rubbish in the scientific literature. Like bad papers have been published, irreproducible results have been published. Those results and data, that scientific data, some of which is true, some of which is not true, is now being fed into large language models and being used to generate more data and information. So I'm very concerned that the rise of generative AI is actually going to unmoor us from empirical reality. It's going to become increasingly hard to know not just what's misinformation or disinformation, but where do you even find what's actually true and empirically real. So I think that just to throw that out there in the dying minutes of this panel, I think is something that all of us in the scientific and medical professions should be concerned about as we move forward.
Yeah, I mean, the AI generated text is coming from somewhere, not out of thin air. My book is in a database of, for when OpenAI, there's a lawsuit going on with publishers related to how books are being fed into these models and how does that deal with copyright. And it's maybe some of the information that I've put out there on the internet is helping people be informed, which is good, but of course it can definitely go the other way. Yeah, so final thoughts. Shannon?
I might go in a little bit of a different direction, and that's also just remembering that we, in our earlier panel, heard that some of you are up until midnight doing your documentation, and so becoming a social media master overnight and educating everyone that you can from there might be hard to do. I think this is also an area of collaboration. So are you at a large health institution that has a media team? Do you have any nonprofit organizations or community organizations that do provide education that you can offer time to speak at on occasion? Are there ways that you can connect your patients internally to supportive care teams? So I think there's ways that we can communicate outside of those platforms that are just online only, but get that information that we want to our patients that you trust from your institutions and not have to do it alone.
I think this is a huge topic. Obviously, I think the takeaway message from my book is that openness about cancer and communication and access to information is not to be taken for granted. So we live in a world where we can search out information and it's not restricted. And that can be at a personal level or on the web or in doctors' offices and in libraries. There are public libraries. I think we just shouldn't take that for granted, that the access to information, however tricky that can be, and however much pressure that puts on patients to make the right decisions, it enables better decisions, better care, better medical outcomes. So I really believe that ultimately open information is the key to, advances in people living healthier lives and faster cures.
Yeah, and certainly the web has helped democratize a bit and empower patients to have more agency, which I think is important to most patients. Great. I think I'm watching the clock in the back, and I think we're kind of at our point. I don't know if anyone has a question. Yeah.
I have a share. Your answer to Joe Rogan in the medical world is Z-Dog with two D's, James MD. Z-Dog MD. He's a physician. He's based in Las Vegas. Z-D-O-G-G-M-D.
Okay. Our new Joe. Yeah. Arney. Yeah. Did you folks on the other side hear his question? Okay. Yeah, so it's, I think a really good question. He asked, is it valuable to invite folks on podcasts or try to kind of surface and push forward stories of folks that maybe listened to some stuff online that maybe wasn't good, and then their negative experience or maybe the negative health outcome? Yeah, I think those, personally, as a journalist, I think those stories are really important. It's hard to get people to openly talk about making a mistake with their own healthcare, but I think those are really important. And Kat, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think this is so important. So when I was at Cancer Research UK, like I say, I was on the kind of conspiracy alternative medicine beat, trying to look into these treatments and communicate them. And I was always on the lookout for people coming forward who'd had bad experiences or with family members. The problem is that certainly the cases that I came across, when people were saying, oh, my family member tried this alternative medicine and they're now dead. So it's very hard to find people who are dead who are prepared to come on podcasts. And like Kate says, it's very hard to get people to admit that they were wrong, that they were fooled. No one wants to come forward and say, yeah, I was a mug. I gave this person all my money. I was hoodwinked. I was looking in to quite a few kind of dodgy cancer cures and cancer clinics, even that are still around. They're not things of the past, and no one wants to admit that they were taken in. So when someone dies or has a negative outcome, they will just say, well, cancer's bad, cancer's hard. People who've had normal conventional treatment, they still die, and that is absolutely true. So it's incredibly hard to find people willing to come forward and talk about a negative impact of all alternative health. Much, much easier to find people who will come forward and talk about the positive impacts of the kind of, the integrative or their own approaches that they've taken, and maybe not mention that they were also having conventional oncological treatments as well, or, surgery and things like that. So it is very challenging trying to find and tell these stories. I wish more people would come forward, and, you really are looking for family members then often if these things have not worked.
And yeah, I mean, I think journalists should be looking for those stories too, and persuading people to tell more stories.
No one follows up on the miracle cure stories. So there's been quite a few certainly in the UK press that I know of, like people saying, "Oh, I did this and I was cured. I took this and I was cured." And then I try and dig out these stories 6 months, a year later, and these people have passed away. The journalists never follow up on them, and I think that is disgraceful.
What an interesting conversation. Let's thank our final panel. And if to put a final point on this, I will just say that we have been streaming this conference all day long and last night, live on X and on YouTube, and the cumulative count is over 7,500 viewers just today alone throughout the day on those two platforms. So that number will go way up as time goes on. So I think that maybe puts a final point on this discussion about new ways and means of communicating about cancer. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending the 2025 Nixon National Cancer Conference. We are wrapped. I want to once again thank all of our sponsors, Dr. von Eschenbach and our steering committee, and all of you for attending. Thank you, and we will see you next year.